In a small, racially divided town, young Sarah Woods grows up facing cruelty and exclusion because of the color of her skin. But despite the odds, she discovers a powerful gift, her ability to tell stories that resonate with the hearts of those who hear them. From the dusty streets of her hometown to the bustling city of Riverstone, Sarah's journey is one of resilience, hope, and courage. As she rises to become a celebrated writer, she battles not just the racism of the world around her, but also the doubts within herself. With every word she writes, Sarah breaks barriers and proves that the power of her voice is stronger than any hate. Join Sarah as she defies expectations and triumphs over the challenges life throws at her, all while staying true to her story. This emotionally moving tale of perseverance and self-discovery will leave you inspired by the strength of one girl's voice in a world determined to silence her. Are you ready to be inspired by a story of courage, resilience, and the power of one girl's voice against the odds? Dive into the journey of Sarah Woods as she rises above racism and hatred to share her message with the world. Watch the full video, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more uplifting and powerful stories that will move your heart and stir your soul. The story begins. Sarah Woods was born in a small, dusty town called Hillridge. Hillridge wasn't known for much, except for its hot sun and cold nights. Sarah's family lived in a tiny, old house that seemed like it was always falling apart. Her parents worked hard every day, but no matter how hard they tried, life never got any easier. Sarah was the youngest of 4 children, and from a young age, she could tell something was different about her family. They were the only black family in the entire town, and people treated them differently. Whenever Sarah walked to school, she could feel eyes watching her, judging her. She didn't understand why at first, but as she grew older, the reasons became clear. People didn't like her family because of the color of their skin. School wasn't easy for Sarah either. The other children refused to sit with her at lunch, and they would call her names that made her feel small. One day, a group of boys threw rocks at her as she walked home. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, tears streaming down her face. That night, Sarah asked her mother, "Why do they hate us?" Her mother, with tired eyes but a gentle smile, said, "They don't understand us, baby. But you have to be strong. You can't let them break you." Those words stayed with Sarah. She promised herself she wouldn't let anyone make her feel small again. As she grew older, Sarah found something she loved more than anything else: telling stories. She would sit under the big oak tree near her house, writing about faraway lands where people of all colors lived together peacefully. Her imagination was endless, and when she wrote, she felt free. But the world wasn't as kind as the one in her stories. When Sarah applied to join the local storytelling contest, the organizers told her, "This contest is for our town's children only." She was crushed. She had lived in Hillridge all her life, but it seemed she would never truly belong. Sarah didn't give up, though. She kept writing, her heart set on finding a place where her stories could be heard. One day, she heard about a storytelling competition in the big city of Riverstone, miles away from Hillridge. It was open to everyone. Excitement filled her as she packed a small bag and set off, despite her parents' warnings about the dangers of traveling alone. The journey to Riverstone was long and difficult. Sarah had to hitch rides from strangers and walk miles in the scorching heat. When she finally arrived in the city, it was nothing like Hillridge. The buildings were tall, the streets were crowded, and the noise was deafening. But Sarah didn't let the city intimidate her. She walked straight to the competition hall, clutching her story tightly in her hands. When it was her turn to read, Sarah stepped up to the stage, her heart pounding. As she began to speak, she could feel the eyes of the audience on her. Some of them looked surprised. Perhaps they had never seen a girl like her on that stage before. But as she told her story, something magical happened. The room grew silent. Her words floated through the air, captivating everyone who listened. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Sarah had done it. She had finally found a place where her voice mattered. After the competition, Sarah was approached by a kind woman named Mrs. Harper, who ran a publishing house in Riverstone. "You have a gift, young lady," Mrs. Harper said. "I want to help you share your stories with the world." Sarah couldn't believe it. Her dreams were finally coming true. But as she started working with Mrs. Harper, she realized the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world of books and stories was controlled by people who didn't think a girl like Sarah had a place there. They told her that people wouldn't want to read stories written by someone like her. But Sarah was determined. She worked harder than ever, pouring her heart and soul into her stories. She wrote about the struggles she faced, the pain of being judged by the color of her skin, and the hope that one day, things would be different. Her first book, The Girl Who Dreamed of Freedom, was published a year later. At first, only a few people bought it, but slowly word began to spread. People were moved by Sarah's words. They felt her pain, her hope, her strength. Soon, her book was being talked about all over the country. But success came with new challenges. Sarah received hateful letters, and some bookstores refused to carry her book. She was invited to speak at events, only to be turned away when they saw who she was. Yet, she never gave up. Sarah believed in her stories, and she believed that the world needed to hear them. One day, as Sarah was walking home from a book event, a man approached her. He was tall and wore a suit that looked expensive. "You're Sarah Woods, right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, unsure of who he was. "I've read your book," the man said. "It's powerful. I work for a major publishing company, and we're interested in helping you reach even more readers." But he paused, glancing around before leaning in closer. "You'll need to tone down the parts about race. It's too controversial. We want to market you to everyone, and that topic might make people uncomfortable." Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and this man was offering her a golden opportunity. But was it worth it if she had to change who she was? Could she silence the very message she had fought so hard to share? She took a deep breath and looked the man in the eye. "Thank you for the offer, but I can't change my story. It's who I am." The man stared at her for a moment before walking away without another word. Sarah knew she had made the right choice, but doubt crept in. What if she never got another chance like that? What if the world wasn't ready for her stories? The next few months were hard. Sales of her book slowed, and invitations to speak became less frequent. But just when Sarah thought her career might be over, something incredible happened. A young girl from a small town wrote her a letter. The girl's name was Lily, and she shared how Sarah's book had given her hope. Lily was the only black girl in her town, just like Sarah had been, and she had felt so alone until she read The Girl Who Dreamed of Freedom. "Your story saved me," Lily wrote. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she read the letter. She realized that even if her story only touched one person, it was worth it. Sarah folded Lily's letter and held it close to her heart. She realized at that moment that her journey wasn't about becoming famous or making money. It was about making a difference, even if it was just for one person at a time. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't need the approval of big publishing companies or the recognition of powerful people. What she needed was to keep telling her truth, to keep writing stories that spoke to the hearts of people like Lily. She started working on her next book, The Voices of the Forgotten. This time, she poured every ounce of pain, hope, and resilience she had into the pages. The book told the story of 5 children from different backgrounds who were all struggling with racism and inequality, but they found strength in their differences and became each other's greatest allies. As Sarah wrote, the memories of her childhood in Hill Ridge came flooding back. She thought of the times she had been told she didn't belong, the looks of disdain she'd received, and the rocks thrown at her. But she also thought of the strength her mother had given her, the power of her imagination, and the kindness of the people she had met along the way, like Mrs. Harper. Once the book was finished, Sarah sent it out to several small publishers. Months passed without a word. The waiting was agonizing, and doubt began to creep in again. Was her story too much? Too real? But Sarah reminded herself that even if it didn't get picked up by a publisher, she would find another way to share it with the world. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mrs. Harper. "I just finished reading your new manuscript," Mrs. Harper said, her voice warm but serious. "It's powerful, Sarah. more powerful than anything you've written before. I want to help you publish this." Sarah's heart leaped with joy, but before she could speak, Mrs. Harper added, "But you have to know, this is going to be a fight. People aren't ready to hear these truths. Are you ready for that?" Without hesitation, Sarah replied, "I've been fighting my whole life, Mrs. Harper. I'm ready." And so, the battle began. The Voices of the Forgotten was published, but it faced backlash from people who didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truths it told. Some bookstores refused to stock it, and some critics tried to dismiss it as too political or too controversial. But Sarah knew that these were just attempts to silence the voices she had worked so hard to amplify. But something incredible happened. Despite the obstacles, the book found its way into the hands of readers who needed it most. People like Lily, who felt alone and unseen. Communities that had been ignored for too long. Parents who wanted to teach their children about empathy and understanding. Sarah began receiving letters from all over the country. Some were from children who saw themselves in her stories for the first time. Others were from adults who were finally beginning to understand the weight of the struggles that people like Sarah had faced their entire lives. One day, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a school in a small town not too different from Hillridge. When she arrived, she was surprised to see that the auditorium was packed. Rows and rows of children, parents, and teachers waited eagerly for her to speak. As she stood at the podium, Sarah looked out at the sea of faces and felt the weight of the moment. She had come so far from the girl who had once been chased home by rocks. Now, her words had the power to heal, to inspire, to unite. She began her speech with a story about her childhood, about the pain of feeling like she didn't belong. But then she spoke about hope, about the power of kindness and the strength of community. She spoke about how, despite everything, she had found her voice, and how every single one of them could find theirs too. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause that moved her. It was the sight of the children's faces, hopeful, inspired, ready to believe that they could make a difference too. After the event, a young boy approached her. He looked nervous, but determined. "Ms. Woods," he asked quietly, "I wanted to say thank you. I was starting to believe the things people said about me, but after hearing you speak, I know they're wrong. I know I'm worth more." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "You are worth more than you can imagine," she said softly. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." As she walked back to her hotel that night, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still be full of challenges, but she knew now that she had the strength to face them. Her story was far from over, and neither was the fight for equality. But for the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, on a path that would lead to real, lasting change. But just as Sarah began to settle into her new life, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in her mailbox, but this one wasn't like the others. It wasn't from a fan or a reader. It was from someone who knew something about Sarah's past. The letter was unsigned, but its message was clear. "You think you've made it, but you've forgotten where you came from. There are things you don't know, things that could destroy everything you've built." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the letter. What could this mean? What could someone possibly know about her that she didn't already know herself? A chill ran down her spine as she realized that her journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Sarah stood at the window of her small apartment in Riverstone, clutching the mysterious letter in her hand. The note had been sitting on her kitchen table for days now. Each time she walked past it, her heart would race. The cryptic message gnawed at her, the words replaying in her mind over and over. "You think you've made it, but you've forgotten where you came from." She didn't know who had sent it, or what the sender meant by it, but something about the message unsettled her. For a while, she was tempted to dig into her past, to try and uncover whatever this mystery was. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't need to. The letter was meant to shake her confidence, to pull her back into the shadows of her past, to undo everything she had worked so hard to build. She wasn't going to let it. One evening, as she sat at her writing desk, the same desk where she had penned her very first story, she took a deep breath and did something she hadn't done since the letter arrived. She picked it up, read it one more time, then gently folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. It didn't belong in her life anymore, just like the fear and shame she had carried for so long. She was done letting the past dictate her future. As the days passed, Sarah poured herself back into her work. She was nearing the end of her third book, Finding Home, a story about a girl much like her, who was on a journey to discover where she truly belonged. This time, though, the ending wasn't about running away or searching for acceptance from others. It was about finding peace within oneself. Sarah was writing her own story, in a way, and as she typed out the final chapter, she realized something. She had found her home, and it had been with her all along. It wasn't in a place or in the approval of others. It was in her voice, her heart, and her courage. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch of her apartment, sipping tea and watching the world go by, she received a visit from Mrs. Harper. The two women had grown close over the years, and Mrs. Harper had become something of a mentor to Sarah. She had seen Sarah's potential when others hadn't, and had guided her through some of the most difficult moments of her career. "Sarah, my dear," Mrs. Harper said, taking a seat next to her, "I've been thinking a lot about your next steps." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "My next steps?" Mrs. Harper smiled. "You've written 3 incredible books, each one more powerful than the last. You've touched the hearts of so many people, and yet, I can't help but wonder if there's something more you could be doing." Sarah frowned, unsure of what Mrs. Harper was getting at. "What do you mean?" "You've always been about more than just the stories, Sarah. You've always been about the message behind them, the desire to make people see the world differently, to challenge the way they think. I think it's time you took that to the next level." Sarah stared at Mrs. Harper, confused. "I don't understand. I'm already writing, speaking at schools, doing what I can." Mrs. Harper placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "What if I told you that there are bigger platforms, bigger opportunities for you to reach even more people? What if I told you that your voice could go beyond just the written words?" Sarah sat back in her chair, thinking. She had always loved writing, always loved the power of stories to change hearts and minds. But what Mrs. Harper was suggesting was something she had never considered. Could she really take that step? Could she really become more than just an author? Mrs. Harper must have seen the doubt in her eyes, because she smiled gently. "You don't have to decide right away, my dear. But think about it. The world needs voices like yours, especially now." Sarah thought long and hard about Mrs. Harper's words. She had always been content to let her stories do the talking, to let her books speak for themselves. But Mrs. Harper was right. The world was changing, and the fight for equality and justice was far from over. Maybe there was more she could do. Maybe her journey wasn't just about writing stories. It was about using her voice to inspire real change. Several months passed, and during that time, Sarah began to explore new ways to share her message. She started giving more speeches, not just at schools but at community centers, libraries, and even larger events. She was invited to speak at a national conference on racial equality, and while she was nervous at first, she found that she loved it. She loved connecting with people, hearing their stories, and sharing her own. Every time she spoke, she felt a little braver, a little stronger. Her work wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were still people who didn't want to hear what she had to say, people who tried to silence her or dismiss her message. But Sarah had learned something important over the years. She didn't need everyone to believe in her. She only needed to believe in herself. One evening, after a particularly moving speech at a university, Sarah was approached by a young woman. The woman had tears in her eyes as she handed Sarah a small, folded piece of paper. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice shaking. "Your words, they've given me hope. I've been struggling with so much, and hearing you tonight made me feel like I'm not alone." Sarah smiled, feeling a familiar warmth in her chest. "You're never alone," she said softly. "Don't ever forget that." The woman nodded, wiping her tears as she walked away. Sarah unfolded the piece of paper and read the words scrawled across it. "Thank you for being a voice for people like me." In that moment, Sarah realized that everything she had been through, all the pain, all the struggles, had led her to this. She had become more than just a writer. She had become a voice for those who couldn't speak, a beacon of hope for those who felt lost. As the years passed, Sarah continued to grow in her work. She published more books, each one building on the foundation she had laid with her first. She became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the country and even internationally, sharing her message of hope, resilience, and the power of stories to change the world. But through it all, she never forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the small, dusty town of Hillridge, or the rocks that had been thrown at her as a child. She never forgot the feeling of being alone, of being judged for the color of her skin. And she never forgot the lessons her mother had taught her about strength and perseverance. One sunny afternoon, many years later, Sarah returned to Hillridge for the first time in decades. She had been invited to speak at the very school she had attended as a child, the same school where she had once felt so out of place. As she stood in front of the students, many of whom were just like she had been, young, scared, and unsure of their place in the world, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. "I used to sit in these very seats," she began, her voice steady. "I used to walk these halls, and I know how hard it can be. I know what it feels like to be different, to be told you don't belong. But I'm here to tell you that you do belong. You belong anywhere you want to be, and your voice matters, more than you can ever know." The students listened intently, some of them wiping away tears. Sarah saw herself in their eyes, the same uncertainty, the same longing for acceptance. And she knew that if she could inspire just one of them to believe in themselves, then all of her struggles would have been worth it. When she finished her speech, the room erupted in applause, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. She had come full circle. She had returned to the place where her journey began, but now she was stronger, wiser, and more at peace with herself than she had ever been. As she left the school, she felt a soft breeze on her face, and for a moment, she could almost hear her mother's voice. "You have to be strong. You can't let them break you." Sarah smiled to herself. She hadn't let them break her. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs too. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not in Hillridge, not in Riverstone, but in a place of strength, love, and purpose. And as the sun set behind her, Sarah knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far. She had made peace with her past, and she was ready to continue writing her future, one story at a time. If Sarah's journey touched your heart and reminded you of the power of perseverance, don't forget to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories, and leave a comment below to let us know how a Black girl's triumph impacted you. Together, let's keep spreading hope and positivity.